In the summer of 2024, 56 years after Tommy and Karen Whitmore vanished, it finally gave back what it had kept hidden since 1968: their car, a blue Chevrolet Bel Air, found at the bottom of the Forked Deer River. It started like any other quiet Sunday in Henderson, Tennessee. The heat hung thick over the town, cicadas droning in the trees, the air heavy with that late summer stillness that feels almost sacred in the South. The Forked Deer River, usually wide and slow-moving, had shrunk to a shadow of itself. Months of drought had drained its power, leaving exposed banks of cracked clay and the ghostly smell of algae and mud. When a local fisherman named Raymond Hatcher went down to check his usual spot that morning, he didn't expect to find anything more unusual than a catfish or two. He was 75, retired, the kind of man who'd spent his entire life within 10 miles of the same river bend. But as he waded knee-deep in the murky water, his line snagged on something that wouldn't budge. He cursed under his breath, thinking it was a log. Then, when the sunlight hit just right, he saw the flash of chrome beneath the silt. Raymond froze. There, under the film of greenish water, something curved, smooth, metallic, and impossibly out of place. He waded closer, squinting, and saw what looked like the outline of a car grill. "Lord have mercy," he muttered. He called the sheriff's office right away. By afternoon, the riverbank was crawling with deputies, news vans, and locals craning for a better view. Sheriff Mark Leland, a stoic man in his late 40s, arrived just as the tow trucks were setting up. The whole scene felt unreal: the shimmering heat, the low hum of the crowd, and in the center, a rusted shape breaking the water's surface. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Henderson had seen cars go off the road before, sure, but this stretch of the Forked Deer was shallow, visible from the bridge. How could something have been sitting there for over half a century without anyone knowing? But when the mud finally loosened and the car was hauled onto dry land, the evidence was unmistakable. Beneath the grime, the faded paint still glowed faintly blue. A cracked Tennessee license plate read, "Whitmore 68. The crowd went silent. Someone gasped. The Whitmores, Tommy and Karen, had been missing since that summer. No trace, no goodbye, no bodies. Just an open wound in the town's history that had never really healed. Sheriff Leland stood there a long time, watching as the tow crew eased open the mangled driver's door. Inside, there were only bones and remnants, a tarnished wedding band on a skeletal hand, a strand of dark hair clinging to the headrest, and the faint smell of decay that had been sealed tight for decades. A reporter murmured, "They found them." The words rippled through the crowd like a chill. That night, the discovery made the local news. By morning, it was everywhere: couple missing, since 1968, found in submerged car, after 56 years. Photos of the Bel Air, half sunk in brown water, filled every feed. To the rest of the country, it was a curiosity, a mystery finally solved, but to the people of Henderson, it was like seeing ghosts climb out of the river. For those who remembered Tommy and Karen, it brought back a flood of memories of the young couple who danced barefoot by the lake, who'd planned to build a house on Miller Hill, who vanished one humid July night and were never seen again. The next morning, Sheriff Leland called the county coroner. The remains were sent to Nashville for testing, but everyone already knew. DNA would only confirm what their hearts had known for half a century. Still, there were questions. The car had gone off the road near a stretch with no guardrail, but the riverbank there wasn't steep. The path was winding, yes, but not dangerous, not unless someone made it so. And the position of the car, nose down, doors locked, both bodies still buckled, told a story that didn't quite fit the easy explanation of an accident. There was something else, too. A small hole in the windshield, round and clean. Not a rock. Sheriff Leland had seen enough to recognize the mark of a bullet. He didn't say anything right away, not to the press, not even to his deputies. He wanted to wait for forensics. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a crime scene, frozen in time. By noon, word had spread faster than he could contain it. Old-timers gathered outside the diner, swapping theories. Younger folks, who'd grown up hearing the name Whitmore in whispers, watched the footage in disbelief. The town that had tried to forget suddenly couldn't talk about anything else. One woman, Martha Green, who'd been Karen's best friend back in high school, showed up at the sheriff's office in tears. "I told everyone she'd never just run off," she said, gripping a tissue. She loved him. They were happy. Something happened to them that night. Leland nodded, promising to reopen the case. But to understand what had happened on that winding river road, he needed to go back to the summer of 1968, when Tommy and Karen were alive, when Henderson was smaller, simpler, and yet hiding all the same shadows that still lingered by the river. That was the summer when the air smelled like honeysuckle and gasoline, when everyone still left their doors unlocked. When a young couple, barely out of their teens, fell in love in a world that didn't know how fragile good things could be. And so, to make sense of the rusted car and the bones within it, we have to start there. Back to where it all began. Before the headlines, before the whispers and the river and the rust, there was just Tommy and Karen, two kids who fell in love the way people do when they think life will go on forever. It was the summer of 1968, and Henderson, Tennessee, was the kind of place where everybody knew your parents, your grandparents, and probably the color of your first bicycle. There were just over 3,000 people living there then, one traffic light downtown, a handful of churches, and a diner called Earl's, where folks went for biscuits in the morning and gossip in the evening. Tommy Whitmore was 21, tall, with an easy grin and hair that curled when he got sweaty. He worked part-time at his father's auto shop, Whitmore's Garage, and spent his nights tinkering with engines behind the house, always smelling faintly of motor oil and mint chewing gum. People said Tommy could fix anything with wheels, and he had the kind of patience that made him good company even when things went wrong. Karen Miller, before she became a Whitmore, was the kind of girl everyone noticed without meaning to. Not because she was loud or showy, but because she had a softness that made people feel seen. She was 20, worked the register at the pharmacy, and dreamed of moving to Memphis to study nursing. Her laugh carried down the street, and she never left the house without a ribbon in her hair. They met at the county fair when they were 15. He won her a stuffed bear by knocking down milk bottles with a baseball. She told him she thought his throw was lucky, not skillful. He said luck was just what you had when you were standing next to her. It was one of those small-town romances that everyone saw coming. They went steady all through high school. Tommy taught her how to drive. Karen baked pies for his mother on Sundays. He took her fishing once, but she spent the whole time talking to the dragonflies and never touched the bait. They weren't perfect, but they fit together in the way that made sense to everyone who knew them. By the time 1968 rolled around, the world outside Henderson was loud and changing, fast protests, rock and roll, men going off to Vietnam. But in that town, time still moved slow. On Saturdays, people washed their cars, kids rode their bikes down Main Street, and young couples like Tommy and Karen parked out by Miller's Lake to watch the sun dip low over the pines. That summer was supposed to be their new beginning. They had just gotten married that spring, in a little white church with peeling paint and magnolias blooming along the fence. Karen's dress was simple, borrowed from her cousin. Tommy wore a suit that was a little too big, but the grin on his face made it fit. Their families threw a reception in the church basement. The men drank punch spiked with bourbon, and the women danced barefoot to the radio. Karen's father gave Tommy a handshake and a warning. "You take care of my girl." Tommy just said, "Always." They moved into a small rental house off Walnut Street. 2 rooms, 1 bathroom, linoleum floors that curled at the edges, and a porch that creaked when you sat on it. Tommy promised he'd fix it up, paint the shutters, plant roses out front. He even drew sketches of the house they'd build one day, up on Miller Hill, overlooking the river. They were young, broke, and happy. Karen started keeping a journal that summer, little notes about their days. On June 12th, she wrote, "Tommy brought home a puppy he found behind the shop. We named him Bandit because he steals my socks." On June 25th, "Tommy's been working late again. Says a man came by asking about a car for sale. Didn't look friendly." And on July 2nd, her last entry, "Dance at the lake tomorrow night. Can't wait to wear the blue dress. Feels like something good is coming." That dance was supposed to be the highlight of the summer, a 4th of July weekend party thrown by the local volunteer fire department. They'd strung lights around the boathouse, set up speakers, and parked pickup trucks in a ring by the shore. It wasn't fancy, but for a town like Henderson, it was everything. The night before, Karen and her best friend, Martha Green, went shopping for matching hair ribbons at the general store. Martha would later tell police how excited Karen had been, how she kept humming to herself, how she'd said, "Tommy seemed a little off lately, but probably just tired from work." Tommy, meanwhile, was having a beer with his friend Bill Oakes out behind the garage. Bill would recall years later that Tommy seemed distracted. He was fidgeting, Bill said in an old interview. Said he'd had words with some guy who came by the shop, something about money owed, but he wouldn't say more. That detail didn't mean much at the time. People in Henderson minded their business. But looking back, it might have been the first crack in the picture-perfect story everyone believed about the Whitmores. The next evening, July 3rd, the air was thick and buzzing with heat. You could smell the river long before you saw it, a mix of moss, gasoline from the boats, and the faint sweetness of barbecue smoke. Karen wore her blue dress, the one that fluttered just above her knees. Tommy had polished the Bel Air until it gleamed under the streetlight, its chrome shining like silver. They left the house around 7, waving to their neighbor Mrs. Dillard, who was watering her geraniums. She looked happy, Mrs. Dillard told reporters decades later. I remember that because she turned back and said, "See you tomorrow," like she meant it. They drove off down Old River Road, music floating out the windows, the Rascals' Groovin' playing on the radio. They danced by the lake, laughed with friends, posed for a photo someone snapped on a Polaroid. That picture would later be one of the last known images of them. Tommy's arm around Karen's waist, the river glimmering behind them, a string of lights reflecting in the water like tiny stars. At around 10:30, a few people saw them talking near the car. Not arguing, exactly, but not smiling either. Witnesses said a man in a brown leather jacket was nearby, leaning against a truck, watching. Nobody knew who he was. By 11, the crowd started thinning out. Fireworks popped in the distance, and someone said Tommy and Karen were leaving. That was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. The next morning, their porch light was still on. Bandit, their puppy, was sitting by the door, whining. The blue dress Karen had worn lay folded on a chair inside. She must have changed before they left, meaning she'd planned to come home. The Bel Air, of course, was gone. At first, no one panicked. Maybe they'd stayed out late, maybe gone to visit friends. But by that evening, when Tommy's father realized his son hadn't shown up for work, and Karen's mother couldn't reach them anywhere, worry began to creep in. By midnight, that worry had turned into fear. When police went looking the next day, they found tire tracks near a sharp curve on Old River Road, the one that ran close to the forked Deer River. But they stopped short, leading nowhere, disappearing into weeds and gravel. It rained that night. Hard. The kind of summer storm that pounds the ground like a warning. Whatever trace might have been left was washed clean by morning. And just like that, Tommy and Karen were gone. Their parents put up flyers, offering rewards, begging for any information. Search parties combed the riverbanks for days. Volunteers in rowboats dragged hooks through the water, praying not to find what they feared. But nothing turned up. No skid marks, no debris, no car, no bodies. The sheriff at the time, Harold Cobb, eventually told the press he believed they'd run off. "Young people do that," he said. "They get restless. Maybe they wanted to start fresh somewhere else." But those who knew them never bought that story. Karen had left her purse, her paycheck, even her wedding ring box on the dresser. Tommy had plans to expand the garage with his father. They'd just adopted a dog. You don't plan a future and then vanish overnight. Years later, people would still drive that stretch of Old River Road and say they could see something out of the corner of their eye, a flash of blue, a shape beneath the water when the sun hit just right. Most brushed it off as imagination, but a few swore they felt something else, a kind of heaviness in the air, as if the river itself was keeping a secret. Whatever happened that night, the forked deer knew. It just wasn't ready to tell. Not yet. July 3rd, 1968. The air in Henderson shimmered with that kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes the night feel alive. The cicadas were already loud by sundown, and every porch light glowed like a lantern against the darkening sky. You could smell the river from blocks away, muddy and sweet, carrying the promise of rain that never came. People in town still talk about that night like it was yesterday. They remember the music, the fireworks, the laughter echoing off the water, and the couple that everyone thought would last forever. Tommy and Karen Whitmore left their little house on Walnut Street just after 7 in the evening. Tommy had spent most of the afternoon shining the Bel Air until it gleamed like glass. Karen, standing in front of the mirror, adjusted her hair ribbon 3 times before finally nodding to herself. She wore the blue dress, but at the last minute, she changed her shoes, white flats instead of heels. Her mother later said that tiny detail haunted her for years. If she'd worn the heels, maybe they'd have gone slower. Maybe they'd have never reached that curve. They were headed to the annual 4th of July Eve lake dance, a town tradition that went back decades. Everyone who could get away from work went. The volunteer fire department set up string lights around the boathouse, tables with paper cups and lemonade, and speakers that played the latest hits from a local AM station. By 8, nearly half the town had gathered by the lakeshore. The evening started soft and easy. Kids caught fireflies in jars. Couples danced barefoot in the grass. Someone lit sparklers, their crackling trails cutting silver arcs through the dark. Tommy and Karen arrived hand in hand, smiling, looking like they belonged in one of those postcards people send from a better time. Friends remember them laughing. Karen had that way of leaning her head back when she laughed, all warmth and light. Tommy kept one hand in his pocket, looking a little nervous maybe because of the man standing near the drinks table watching them. That man wasn't from Henderson. No one knew his name that night. But folks would remember him later. Tall, leather jacket. Despite the heat, a cigarette glowing in the dark. He wasn't dancing. He was waiting. Around 9, Tommy went to grab drinks, while Karen and her friend Martha swayed to stand by me. Martha would later tell investigators that when Tommy came back, he looked tense. He was glancing toward the parking lot, she said. I asked if he was okay, and he said, "Yeah, just someone from work. It's fine." But it didn't sound fine. The stranger didn't approach them. He stayed in the shadows, watching. But when the night wound down, when couples started to leave and headlights flared through the trees, some people noticed him again, this time near the road leading out of the lake. Just before 10:30, a few saw Tommy and Karen heading that way. He was holding her hand, saying something she couldn't quite hear over the music. Karen laughed, though it sounded forced. The stranger's truck was parked nearby, engine idling. And then, they were gone. No one remembers hearing tires screech or seeing the car veer off the road. No one remembers a splash or a scream. It was as if the darkness swallowed them whole. The last photograph of them, taken that night by Martha's cousin, shows them smiling under the lights. Karen's eyes are half closed, Tommy's arm around her waist. Behind them, barely visible, a figure stands at the edge of the frame. Some say it was just another dancer, others aren't so sure. At 11:30, Martha got home. She said she almost called Karen to make sure they'd arrived safely, but she didn't want to seem overprotective. It was late, she told reporters years later. And they were adults, married. I thought they'd be fine. They never made it home. By sunrise, their absence was clear. The Bel Air wasn't in the driveway. Bandit was scratching at the door, whining. Karen's purse was on the kitchen counter, her lipstick open beside it. The ashtray held one half-smoked cigarette, as if Tommy had put it down expecting to pick it back up later. Her mother, Helen Miller, called the house 3 times before walking over. When no one answered, she peeked through the window and saw the breakfast dishes still on the table from the morning before. That's when she knew something was wrong. Tommy's father, Robert Whitmore, came by soon after, his face pale. They wouldn't just leave, he said, not without saying something. By afternoon, half the town was out searching. Men in boots combed the ditches along Old River Road. Kids rode bikes up and down the main street calling their names. The sheriff's deputies checked nearby motels, gas stations, even the bus station in Jackson. Nothing. No one saw the Bel Air. No one saw the couple. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. Around dusk, a farmer named Ed Lively told police he thought he'd heard something the night before, an engine revving, then a splash somewhere near the river bend. He hadn't thought much of it then. Folks went fishing late sometimes, but when the story broke, he couldn't shake the sound. It was quick, he said, like metal hitting water. Then silence. Deputies dragged that stretch of the forked Deer River for 3 days. They found a tire, a few beer cans, and a sunken rowboat, but no car. The water was murky and deep in places, the current unpredictable. Sheriff Harold Cobb eventually told the press they'd done all they could. But the families refused to give up. Helen Miller made flyers with their photos and taped them to every storefront window. Missing since July 3rd, they read. Please call with any information. For weeks, she waited by the phone. She kept Karen's favorite dress laid across the bed, ironed and clean, as if her daughter might walk through the door any minute. Robert Whitmore kept searching the back roads, every day, in his pickup truck. He drove as far as Kentucky once, chasing a rumor that a young couple had been spotted at a diner there. It wasn't them. Days turned into weeks. The fireworks stands came down, The lights around the boathouse were packed away, and life in Henderson went on, at least for most people. But some things didn't fade. There was a rumor that the stranger from the dance had been asking about Tommy a few days earlier, something about a car or money owed. Another rumor said he was from Memphis, part of a rough crowd. No one ever confirmed it. Others whispered darker things, that maybe Tommy and Karen had fought that night, that maybe he'd driven too fast, that maybe one of them had meant to leave the other, but no one who truly knew them believed it. The police report from that week is thin, just a few pages. Statements from friends, a list of items found in their home, and a brief note about tire marks near the river bend. Inconclusive, it says. No evidence of foul play. Still, even back then, people couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. Martha visited the lake a few days after the search ended. She stood near the boathouse, the same spot where they danced. The water was calm, but every now and then, she swore she saw bubbles rising from the surface, as if something down there was trying to breathe. She threw a flower into the water and whispered, "Come home." Years later, when she saw the photo of the car being pulled from that same river, she said she felt the hair on her arms stand up. "I knew," she said. "I knew they'd never left. The river had them all along." But back then, in the summer of 1968, no one knew what to believe. Hope lingered, even as it started to feel heavier with each passing day. The Whitmore house sat quiet that summer, the porch light burning every night, just in case. Neighbors said the dog, Bandit, would sit by the window for hours, watching the road. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, you could hear the faint echo of music from the lake. Maybe it was just the cicadas, maybe just memory. But people swore it sounded like that same song "Stand By Me" playing softly across the water. The night of the dance became legend. Parents told their kids not to drive that road after dark. Couples crossed themselves when they passed the bend. And every year, when the fireworks went up, there was always a moment when someone in town would fall quiet, remembering. Because somewhere between the laughter, the lights, and the music, 2 young lives had slipped away unseen, unheard, but never forgotten. And the river, patient as always, held its silence. The morning of July 4th, 1968, began with the kind of brightness that makes everything look sharper than it should. The sky was cloudless, the air already hot enough to shimmer above the pavement, and the sound of the town's parade drums carried down every street. But inside the Whitmore and Miller homes, that holiday morning was silent. Too silent. By 9 a.m., the phone at the Whitmore's house had rung a dozen times. Tommy's father, Robert, had called the garage to see if his son had shown up early. No answer. Helen Miller had tried the pharmacy, then the diner, then half her neighbors. Still nothing. At first, people brushed it off. Maybe the young couple had gone up to Nashville for the holiday weekend. Maybe they'd stayed with friends. Maybe their car had broken down somewhere and they'd get a ride home later. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, that thin veil of optimism started to unravel. By noon, Robert Whitmore was in his truck, driving every back road he could think of, the same ones Tommy had driven since he was 16. He stopped at gas stations, diners, even the old quarry road where kids used to go parking. He showed a photo of the 2 of them, Karen laughing, Tommy squinting against the sun, and asked the same question over and over. "You seen this couple? Blue Chevy Bel Air? Drove off last night from the lake?" Most just shook their heads. By dusk, fear had started to settle over the families like a thick fog. The fireworks stands opened, kids ran with sparklers, and the world kept moving, but for the Whitmores and the Millers, the 4th of July meant nothing that year. Around 7 that evening, Helen Miller marched down to the sheriff's office in her housecoat, hair unbrushed, clutching Karen's photograph. She slammed it on the counter. "They're missing," she said, voice trembling. "Something's happened to my daughter." Sheriff Harold Cobb, a heavy-set man with kind eyes but not much imagination, leaned back in his chair. "Now, Mrs. Miller," he said gently, "I'm sure they're fine. Young folks take off sometimes. Maybe they just needed a little space." Helen wasn't having it. She didn't take off. Her purse is still on the table. Her shoes are by the door. They were supposed to come home. Cobb sighed and agreed to make a few calls, but his tone said he didn't think it was urgent. Back then, in small towns like Henderson, missing adult cases didn't light up alarm bells right away. People ran off all the time, or so they said. By the next morning, though, even Sheriff Cobb couldn't ignore it. No one had heard from the Whitmores. Their car hadn't been spotted anywhere. Their friends all said the same thing. They'd left the dance together, happy, and never made it home. That Sunday, Cobb organized a search. Volunteers gathered at dawn, farmers, shop owners, a few of Tommy's friends from the garage. They split into groups, covering every mile between the lake and the highway. Men waded into the river with poles, calling the couple's names. Women brought sandwiches and coffee to the searchers. By afternoon, the sheriff's deputies found the first sign that made everyone stop and stare. Near the bend on Old River Road, about a mile past the lake turnoff, they found tire tracks. Faint, but visible. 2 sets, one leading toward the water, one stopping short. The tracks disappeared into soft earth, and then nothing, swallowed by the grass. Cobb crouched down, running his hand over the prints. Could have been from last week's rain, he said. Hard to tell how fresh they are. But the truth was, they matched the kind of tires you'd find on a Chevy Bel Air. The men dragged that section of river for 2 days. They used chains, grappling hooks, even an old refrigerator magnet someone claimed could pull metal from the bottom, but the river kept its secrets. The forked deer was slow but deceptive, wide in some places, shallow in others, with hidden drop-offs that twisted like veins. By the end of that week, the only thing they'd pulled up were 2 license plates from unrelated wrecks and a sunken bicycle frame. Still, the rumors began. One man said he'd seen headlights near the river around midnight on the 3rd. Another claimed he heard shouting, maybe an argument. Someone swore they saw a brown truck parked off the road with its lights off. But none of it led anywhere. Helen Miller refused to rest. She walked the riverbanks herself, calling her daughter's name into the reeds, her voice hoarse. Tommy's father stopped sleeping altogether, spending every night at the garage, sitting by the phone just in case it rang. The sheriff finally put out a statewide bulletin for a missing couple, last seen in blue Chevy Bel Air Tennessee plates Whitmore 68. But after 2 weeks without leads, the case went cold. The official line was simple: possible accident, possible voluntary disappearance. The unofficial one was far murkier. Folks around town started whispering about that stranger from the dance, the man in the leather jacket. A few said they'd seen him talking to Tommy earlier that week. Some claimed he'd come by the garage asking for a car or money owed. Others thought he was from Memphis, maybe tied to something unsavory. But with no name, no plate number, and no witness who could give a clear description, he might as well have been smoke. By August, even the local paper had stopped printing updates. For the Whitmores and the Millers, life splintered into before and after. Before laughter, plans, and hope. After silence, unanswered questions, and an ache that never went away. Helen kept Karen's room exactly as it was. The bed made, perfume bottles lined on the dresser, a hair ribbon still looped around the lamp. She'd go in some nights just to sit there, breathing in what was left of her daughter's scent. Robert kept a map pinned to the wall of the garage, marking every sighting or rumor that came in. He wrote dates beside them, red ink for false leads, blue for maybes. By the end of that year, the map looked like a patchwork of disappointment. In the fall, a hunter found a scrap of metal in the woods near the river, about half buried in leaves. It looked like it could have come from a car bumper. Everyone held their breath, maybe it was from the Bel Air. But when they brought it to the sheriff, he said it didn't match. Different make, different year, he said, scratching his head. And so the case faded. People still mention them sometimes. At the diner, over pie and coffee, someone would say, "You remember those Whitmore kids?" And the table would fall quiet. But as years passed, new faces moved to town. The lake dance continued every summer. Old River Road was repaved, guardrails added, weeds cleared. Still, there were those who swore they saw things. One woman said she'd seen headlights under the water one night, 2 faint orbs glowing beneath the surface like eyes. A trucker claimed his radio picked up strange static whenever he drove past the river bend. A kid fishing by the bridge said he heard a woman's voice whisper his name. Of course, stories grow in small towns, but those who'd loved Tommy and Karen never laughed them off completely, because something about their disappearance didn't sit right. No note, no luggage, no money taken. Both families swore they were happy, planning for the future. And that bullet rumor, the one whispered by one of the deputies years later, it lingered. He'd told a friend after retiring that the windshield on the Whitmore car, if it was ever found, might tell a story nobody wanted to read. He died before saying more. By 1970, Sheriff Cobb had retired. The file on the Whitmore case, thin as it was, got tucked into a drawer marked "Cold Cases." And for more than 5 decades, that's where it stayed. until the summer of 2024, when the river, starved by drought, dropped lower than anyone could remember. The same bend where those tire tracks once ended suddenly revealed something shiny beneath the mud. A fisherman saw it first. By the end of that day, every secret the Forked Deer River had been keeping since 1968 was about to come crashing back into the sunlight. But before that moment of discovery, before the whole world came to know the Whitmores' fate, there were still 56 long years of waiting, of hoping, of wondering, and of the haunting silence that filled every 4th of July night in Henderson. For the families who never stopped asking, the missing weren't gone, they were just waiting to be found. And the river, patient and watchful, was waiting too. The morning after Helen Miller marched into the sheriff's office, Henderson woke up to something it hadn't felt in years: tension. It was in the air, thick and unspoken, like humidity before a storm. The Whitmores' disappearance wasn't just a family's tragedy anymore. It was a town's mystery. By dawn, word had spread. Someone had gone missing. Tommy and Karen Whitmore, that young couple everyone knew. The news traveled fast, hopping from front porches, to the diner, to the barber shop, to the pews of the early Sunday church service. "Can you believe it?" Mrs. Dillard whispered to her neighbor. "That sweet Miller girl? Gone?" "Maybe they ran off," another voice murmured. "Young people do things like that." But no one said it with much conviction, because people who run away don't usually leave their dog behind, or their toothbrushes, or the light on. By 8 a.m., Sheriff Harold Cobb had a plan, or at least what passed for one. He organized a volunteer search party, splitting people into teams. One would check the roads and ditches from Henderson to Jackson. Another would walk the banks of the Forked Deer River, starting from the lake and following it north. The sheriff's deputies brought boats, but most were borrowed from locals: dented john boats, leaky rowboats, a few canoes. Men brought ropes, hooks, and flashlights. Someone even brought a set of old scuba goggles, though the river was too murky for that to do much good. Helen stood on the bank that morning, holding a thermos of coffee she didn't drink, her eyes scanning every boat that left the shore. Tommy's father stood beside her, his face hollow, silent. The two of them barely spoke. They didn't have to. Their grief was a shared language. The searchers combed every stretch of water they could reach. They pushed through reeds, called out names that echoed back empty. They found turtles, fishing lures, soda cans, the leftovers of summers past, but no sign of the car, and no trace of the couple. By mid-afternoon, the July heat was unbearable. Men stripped down to undershirts, sweat darkening their collars. Still, they didn't stop. The sheriff tried to stay optimistic. "Maybe they just got turned around," he told the press. "Could be a simple car trouble situation." But no one really believed that. Not anymore. Around 3 that afternoon, a deputy named Earl Watkins found something curious. Near the sharp bend of Old River Road, the same place where the tire tracks had been spotted, he noticed a patch of disturbed soil, a faint glint of something metallic just below the surface. He called the sheriff over, and together they dug a little. It turned out to be nothing more than a piece of broken chrome, probably from a fender, but it was enough to keep hope alive for a few more hours. They searched that area hard, dragging the water over and over again, but the river refused to give anything up. As the sun began to set, the sheriff finally called it for the day. "We'll start again at first light," he said, though his voice carried the weight of doubt. That night, Henderson felt different. The fireworks still went off, but half-heartedly. Kids waved sparklers, but parents kept glancing toward the river. At the diner, the usual chatter was replaced by low murmurs. Everyone had a theory, and no two matched. "Could have been an accident," one man said. "That old road's tricky. No lights, no guardrail. Easy to miss the turn." Another shook his head. "No, sir. I seen that boy drive. He knew those roads better than the sheriff himself. Something happened to them, and I bet that fella in the leather jacket knows what." The fella in the leather jacket, that was the name they gave the stranger no one could identify. In the days that followed, his image grew with every retelling. He became taller, meaner, more mysterious. Some said he'd been seen at the garage 2 days before the disappearance, arguing with Tommy. Others claimed he'd been at the dance watching Karen all night. The sheriff tried to track him down, but with no name and no clear description beyond dark hair and brown truck, there wasn't much to go on. By the end of that first week, the official search had slowed. The volunteers dwindled. but the families didn't stop. Robert Whitmore borrowed a flat-bottomed boat from a friend and spent his nights drifting down the river with a flashlight and a hook, searching. Helen Miller kept a candle in her window every evening, telling herself that as long as the flame burned, Karen wasn't truly gone. One night, about a week into the search, Robert swore he saw something in the water, a shape, dark and smooth, just below the surface near the bend. He rowed toward it, heart pounding, but when he reached the spot, it was gone. The current was slow there, almost still, yet whatever he'd seen had vanished as if the river itself had pulled it away. He didn't tell anyone about that for years, not until much later, when the car was finally pulled from that same bend, rusted and broken, exactly where he'd thought he saw something all those decades before. Back in '68, though, the frustration was unbearable. The sheriff called in the State Highway Patrol for assistance, but they found nothing. They even brought in a diver from Jackson, though visibility was near zero in the Forked Deer's muddy water. The diver surfaced after just a few minutes, shaking his head. "You could hide a whole town under there and never see it," he said. After 10 days, the sheriff gave a statement to the local paper. All leads exhausted, no evidence of foul play at this time. Helen read the headline and tore the paper in half. "No foul play," she muttered. "My daughter doesn't just disappear." She was right. But no one knew how to prove it. By August, the missing posters had started to curl at the edges. The photos faded from sun and rain. Kids who'd once helped search were back at school. The Whitmore case was slipping quietly out of conversation. Except in one house. Helen wrote letters every week to newspapers in Memphis and Nashville, asking them to cover the story. Most never replied. One reporter from the Memphis Press Scimitar finally came down in late August. He interviewed the families, walked the riverbanks, and wrote a small column titled, "Young Love Lost, Henderson Couple Vanishes Without Trace." The article described Tommy and Karen as the perfect pair, bright and hopeful, symbols of small-town innocence. It ended with a haunting line that stuck with readers for decades. Somewhere, the river holds its breath, waiting to tell what it knows. After that, the calls started. People claimed they'd seen them in Jackson, in Arkansas, in Georgia. One man said he'd picked up a hitchhiking couple that looked just like them. Another said he'd seen a blue Chevy Bel Air parked outside a roadside bar in Tupelo. The sheriff checked each lead. Every one of them fell apart. Still, Helen and Robert clung to hope. They kept their phone plugged in by the bed, the line never far from reach. Every ring made their hearts jump. But it was always wrong numbers, telemarketers, or silence. By the first anniversary, 1969, the town had moved on. But for the families, time had stopped. Tommy's father closed the garage for good that spring. "Can't work on cars when my boy's still out there somewhere," he said. Helen stopped going to church. She said she couldn't stand to hear the prayers for other people when hers went unanswered. And every time she passed the river, she'd slow her car, roll down the window, and listen as if waiting for a sound that might tell her something she'd missed. Decades later, when the car was finally found, divers would note that the river had shifted over time. Mud, silt, and tree roots had built up over the wreck, hiding it completely. It had been there all along, buried deep underwater in memory. But in those first few desperate weeks of 1968, no one could have known that the answer was right there, only a few yards from where they'd stood, calling into the wind. The Forked Deer was silent then, as it always was. But silence, as the years would prove, doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it just means the story isn't done speaking. In a town as small as Henderson, truth doesn't travel, it drifts. Slow, crooked, and tangled with every whisper it brushes past. By the end of that long, sweltering summer of 1968, the disappearance of Tommy and Karen Whitmore had already begun to take on a life of its own. When no answers come, people start making their own. The official search was over, but the talk never stopped. At the diner, over cold coffee and pie, the stories grew legs. At church, the whispers followed the hymns. And down at Whitmore's old garage, shuttered now, the sign faded and the smell of oil still lingering. Men would stand around, leaning on their trucks, talking about what they thought really happened. "They didn't just run off," one man said, shaking his head. "That boy had too much pride for that. If he was in trouble, he'd have faced it head on." Another replied, "You heard about that stranger? The one in the leather jacket? I bet he's behind it. Probably caught up in something shady. Maybe Tommy owed him money." No one could prove it, but it didn't matter. In Henderson, A rumor felt as real as fact once enough people said it out loud. There were theories, plenty of them. Some thought Tommy had gotten mixed up in a car theft ring. Others swore Karen had been seeing someone else, maybe someone older, and the two of them had run away together. One woman even claimed she saw a man matching Tommy's description in Mississippi, working at a gas station under a different name. Every new sighting sent the families on a new wave of hope that crashed even harder when it turned out false. Helen Miller, exhausted and heartsick, began writing down every rumor in a notebook page after page of names, places, times. "If I can keep them all straight," she said once, "then maybe one of them will turn out to be true." But the more she wrote, the stranger the stories got. By autumn, a few people started talking about things that couldn't be explained by logic alone. One neighbor swore she'd seen headlights glowing under the water late one night, long after the search had ended. Another said she'd heard music coming from the river faint, like a radio playing beneath the surface. At first, people laughed those off. But then, a man named Frank Blaylock, who ran a bait shop near the bend, told the sheriff he'd seen something unusual. "A woman," he said, "standing by the water at dawn, looked just like Karen. I called out, but she disappeared. I swear to God, Harold, she just vanished." The sheriff dismissed it. "You saw fog," he said. "That river plays tricks on your eyes in the morning." Still, the story spread. By winter, the case had gone from tragedy to ghost tale. Kids dared each other to walk Old River Road after dark. They said if you stood by the guardrail and whispered their names, you'd hear a car engine start up from somewhere beneath the water. And somewhere along the line, a woman named Evelyn Hart came into the picture, a self-proclaimed psychic from Jackson who'd read about the case in the newspaper. She showed up at Helen Miller's door one afternoon, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a shawl that smelled of lilac and smoke. "I saw your daughter in a vision," she said softly. "She's near the river. She wants to come home." Helen didn't believe in psychics, not really. But grief has a way of making even the most skeptical heart open to strange things. She let Evelyn in. The psychic asked for a piece of Karen's jewelry, something she'd worn often. Helen hesitated, then handed over a silver charm bracelet. Evelyn closed her eyes, murmured something low, then said, "There was fear, and water. A man with dark eyes." Helen clutched her hands together. "What man?" But Evelyn didn't answer. She simply whispered. "He followed them." The sheriff, when he heard about it later, called it nonsense. But some of his deputies weren't so sure. One of them, a young officer named Roy Timmons, said, "What if she's right?" Sheriff Cobb glared at him. "We don't chase ghosts, son. We chase facts." Problem was, there weren't any facts left to chase. By 1969, the Whitmore disappearance had been eclipsed by new stories. The world was changing: the moon landing, the war, riots in big cities. Henderson was just a small dot on a big map, and a missing couple from a year ago didn't make the papers anymore. But every once in a while, something would happen to stir the embers. One summer evening in '71, a young couple driving home from Jackson crashed their car along the same stretch of Old River Road. The driver survived but swore he'd swerved because he saw another vehicle, a blue one, looked like a '50s model, coming straight toward him before vanishing into the mist. People shook their heads. "The Whitmores," someone whispered, "still driving that road." By then, the families were shells of who they'd been. Robert Whitmore aged fast, his hair turning gray before 50. Helen Miller stopped answering the door. She told friends she could feel her daughter's presence, sometimes the scent of her perfume, the sound of footsteps on the porch when no one was there. Martha Green, Karen's best friend, tried to move on, but she never forgot. She'd later tell interviewers that she dreamed about Karen often. "She's always by the water," Martha said. "Sometimes she's calling to me. Sometimes she's just standing there, looking sad, like she's waiting for me to notice something." Rumors became folklore, and folklore became memory. By the '80s, the Whitmore story was something people told newcomers, a local legend about love and loss. Teenagers dared each other to sneak out to the river bend and flash their headlights 3 times to see if the Bel Air's lights would flash back. But underneath the ghost stories, something else lingered: a suspicion that the truth wasn't supernatural at all. When Sheriff Cobb died in 1983, his daughter went through his things and found an old box labeled W Case. Inside were the original reports, faded photographs, and a few notes that hadn't made it into the official file. One of them, written in Cobb's hand, read, "Talk to mechanic from Jackson again," said Tommy was dealing with a man named Doyle. Claimed to be buying car parts. Might be connected. No one knew who Doyle was. No follow-up report was ever found. The trail stopped there. But decades later, when the car was finally pulled from the forked Deer River, investigators would rediscover that note and realize Doyle wasn't just some passing name. He'd been real. And he'd had a reason to want Tommy gone. Still, in the years between, all Henderson had were whispers. By the 90s, the families were mostly gone. Robert passed in '89. Helen followed a few years later. In her will, she left one request: to have her ashes scattered by the river. "So when my girl comes home," she wrote, "she'll find me waiting." The town quieted after that. Until one hot afternoon, 56 years later, when a fisherman's line snagged on something deep in the mud. And all those old whispers, the ones that had never really died, came rushing back to life. Because sometimes, small towns forget the truth on purpose. But the river never does. By the time the 1970s rolled in, the world had changed, but in Henderson, Tennessee, the air still held the same weight of something unfinished. The Whitmore case had slipped from headlines into hushed memory, the kind that never really dies but lingers like a photograph left too close to the Sunday. The posters were gone. The volunteers had gone back to work. The sheriff had moved on to newer cases: burglaries, bar fights, lost dogs. But for the two families left behind, every day felt the same: waiting. Time, people say, heals everything. They never tell you that it also hardens what it can't fix. Helen Miller woke up every morning and made 2 cups of coffee. One for herself, one for Karen. She'd set the second on the kitchen table, next to her daughter's photograph, and whisper, "Morning, baby." Then she'd sit in silence, sipping hers until it went cold. Across town, Robert Whitmore spent his days in the garage, though it wasn't open to customers anymore. He'd tinker with old engines, half finished, half forgotten, the radio playing softly in the background. Sometimes, neighbors would hear him talking, just his voice and the faint hum of the air compressor, and they'd wonder who he was talking to. But they never asked. Every year on July 3rd, the Millers and Whitmores would meet at the river. Even after most people had stopped coming, they'd bring flowers and light candles, setting them afloat on the water. The flames drifted slow, flickering as they disappeared around the bend. "Maybe she'll see it," Helen would say. The years stretched. The once bright blue Bel Air faded into rumor, the kind that children grew up hearing about. Old River Road became a place people avoided at night, especially near the curve where the couple had vanished. Teenagers, though they were drawn to it, that's what happens with mysteries. They dared each other to drive out there, park by the guardrail, and call the names Tommy and Karen 3 times. Some swore they saw lights flicker under the water. Others claimed to hear a girl's laughter in the trees. By 1975, the old sheriff, Harold Cobb, was gone. The new sheriff, Earl Watkins, the same deputy who'd once found those faint tire tracks, reopened the case briefly. Not officially, but enough to satisfy his own curiosity. He'd been haunted by that summer for years. He told a local reporter, "Something about it always felt wrong. We just didn't have the tools back then." He went through the evidence again, what little there was. A few photos, a list of missing personal items, and that note about a man named Doyle. Earl tried to find him. He ran through records, old auto shop contacts, even called a few garages in Memphis. Nothing. Doyle might have been a nickname, or maybe just another ghost in a story that had too many. Still, something in the file bothered him, a missing detail he couldn't unsee. In one of the reports, there was mention of a witness who'd heard arguing near the lake that night. But the name of that witness had been blacked out, replaced with a line of typewriter ink. No explanation. When Earl asked the county clerk about it, she shrugged. "That was before my time," she said. "Might have been an error, or maybe the sheriff thought it wasn't relevant." He dropped it, but the unease stayed with him until the day he died. Meanwhile, Henderson grew. New houses, new stores, new faces. But the river stayed the same. By the 80s, only a handful of people still remembered the Whitmores personally. Martha Green, Karen's best friend, was one of them. She'd married, had kids, and stayed in town. But every time she drove past the river bend, she slowed down. Sometimes she even stopped. She'd sit there with her hand on the steering wheel, staring at the water. "You can feel it," she once told her daughter, "like the river's breathing different there." Martha kept one photograph of her and Karen from that last summer, the two of them sitting on the hood of the Bel Air, laughing, the world still wide open in front of them. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away, even after the colors began to fade and the corners curled. In 1989, when Robert Whitmore passed away, the local paper ran a small obituary. It mentioned his son by name, preceded in death by Thomas Whitmore, missing since 1968. Helen attended the funeral, sitting alone in the back. She didn't cry. She just stared at the coffin and whispered, "He's with him now." 3 years later, Helen followed. In her will, she left simple instructions. No funeral, no grave marker. Just her ashes scattered at the forked Deer River, near the curve where the road dips low. "Put me where she was last seen," she'd written, "so when they find her, I'll be waiting." After that, the story faded again. By the 90s, Old River Road had been repaved. Guardrails went up, and the sharp bend was straightened a little. People forgot what had happened there. The younger generation thought of the Whitmores as a myth, like the lovers who vanished on prom night, the kind of ghost story you tell around a bonfire. But some didn't forget. In 2008, a true crime blogger from Memphis, Jenna Harris, came across the case while researching unsolved disappearances. The file fascinated her: a young couple, a missing car, a vanished night. She visited Henderson, interviewed old residents, and walked the riverbanks. Her article, "The Vanishing of the Whitmores, Tennessee's Forgotten Mystery," went viral for a few weeks. For the first time in decades, people started talking again. Jenna uncovered a few new details, like the note about Doyle and a record showing Tommy had withdrawn $200 in cash the day before he disappeared. Adjusted for inflation, it was a decent sum. But there was no record of what he'd done with it. In her article, Jenna asked a question that would echo for years. What if the river wasn't hiding an accident? What if it was hiding a secret someone wanted buried? That line caught the attention of a man named Sheriff Mark Leland, a rookie back then, but sharp, methodical, and curious. He made a mental note, the kind you tuck away for later, for when life brings you back to the right place, the right time. Decades later, he would be the man standing on the bank when the river finally gave up its secret. But before that, there were the years of nothing. Empty holidays, quiet anniversaries, families who left town but never really escaped. One of Karen's cousins once said, "Every time I visited Henderson, I'd feel it, like the whole town was holding its breath." Because even when people stopped talking about a tragedy, they never truly stopped feeling it. The river was still there, patient, unchanging, winding through fields and under bridges, whispering through reeds. And beneath that calm surface, the Bel Air slept. The metal decayed, the paint peeled, the windows clouded with silt. Fish swam through the hollowed-out cabin where Tommy and Karen had once Saturday. Their bones shifted gently with the current, untouched, unseen, but never lost. The river, like the town, just waited. Until the summer of 2024, when the drought came, when the waterline dropped lower than anyone could remember. When, for the first time in 56 years, sunlight touched metal that hadn't seen the sky since 1968. The story that had haunted generations was about to come back, and this time, it wouldn't be whispers. It would be truth. The summer of 2024 inches, Henderson was relentless. Month after month passed without rain. The sky stayed a pale, washed-out blue. In town, lawns browned. The river that had once wound lush and wide through the fields grew still and shallow. Local farmers spoke of cracked earth and wilting crops. Folks who lived near the forked Deer said you could hear roots scraping the bottom, something you'd never hear when the water ran full. By midsummer, more than half of Tennessee was classified under drought conditions, one of the driest stretches the state had seen in decades. WPLN News +1 streams shrank into icy veins, and tributaries that once teemed with minnows now lay lifeless in the Sunday. In Henderson, the forked Deer had receded so far in places that muddy banks, previously underwater, were exposed for the first time in generations. It was as if the land itself was retreating, pulling back, making room for secrets long submerged to find their way back to the surface. Raymond's find. Raymond Hatcher, the old fisherman who had known the river longer than most, had been out early that morning. He liked the quiet hours before the heat came, before the world crowded in. The water was low, languid, with wide expanses of mudflats and small pools where fish clustered, half suffocated. He walked slowly, his boots sinking in soft silt, his line trailing behind him like a loose thread. At first, the snag felt like any of 100 branches buried in the mud. A hard pull, then resistance. He yanked. It didn't budge. He knelt and peered closer. Something metallic glinted beneath the daylight. His breath caught. He pulled harder. The thing shifted. Chrome, curved metal. He slapped his hand down, trying not to scare it away. He called out loud and trembling, "Sheriff, come quick! I think I found something." By mid-morning, the banks of the river, usually quiet, unremarkable, had become a scene. Sheriff Mark Leland, whose curiosity about the Whitmore case had simmered for years, arrived just as the sun beat down hard. He stepped onto a boat borrowed from a local farmer and steered toward the glint under the water. A group of deputies stood on the bank, others taking photos, neighbors trying to see, children craning their necks. The river had never looked so shallow in that stretch. Mud and silt swept away where the current had drifted. Branches and logs had shifted. And there it was, the front of a car, half exposed, the grille and headlights just breaking the surface. The Bel Air. They dragged in ropes and chains. The vehicle was stubborn, heavy, caked in decades of river sludge. But the low water made it possible to attach lines. The crowd pulled, the winch groaned, the car creaked like an old door opening after years of stiffness. Slowly, inch by inch, the Bel Air rose. Water sluiced off its roof, mud peeled away in slabs. The first thing anyone saw was the large chrome bumper, dented and twisted, plating peeling. The hood hinge had rusted nearly into oblivion. Then, the windshield, cracked, the glass fogged with interior debris. When the car was lifted onto dry land, gasps echoed. The crowd parted. A hush fell, broken only by the drip of water, the creaking of metal, the murmur of disbelief. From the outside, it looked ghostly, a relic, a shell, a memory made real. Shock and confirmation. Leland stood in front of the car, wiping sweat from his brow, his face rigid with something between dread and resolution. For 56 years, the Whitmore case had been a cold file, a ghost in the corners of town. Now the evidence lay before him, in rust and bone and silence. Investigators fanned out. Photos were taken. The coroner was called. The area was taped off. Forensics team members waded through the interior, careful with their steps. Cameras clicked. The local news crews crowded the edges, broadcasting live. Inside, amid the debris, they found what they'd feared: human remains. Skeletal frames slumped in the seats. In the driver's side, residues of seat springs. On the back seat, unidentifiable scraps of fabric, a wedding band on a finger bone, and a long strand of hair, still dark, draped over the backrest. Within hours, DNA tests were ordered, cross-matching with the Whitmore family. Breath waited on the bank. The town held its collective breath. The coroner's preliminary report suggested that the pair had been in the car when it entered the river. The doors were closed, seatbelts still fastened, where mechanics of degradation allowed. The car, nose first, in a descent that must have been slow but inexorable. It was too coincidental to call chance. The pattern, the positioning, the fact that the foreign man in the leather jacket, rumors always circled that stretch everything, pulsed with possibilities darker than accident. Sheriff Leland, older now than Cobb had been when Tommy and Karen disappeared, told reporters, "This is more than a recovery. This is a reopening. This is a chance to finally listen to what the river has been trying to tell us all along." Rising questions. How had a car sat underwater for more than half a century and remained undetected? The drought was key. When water levels were normal, the vehicle had lain beneath the current, cloaked by depth and silt. Suspended organic matter, algae, fast-moving flow would have hidden its silhouette. But as the river shrank, so did its covering. The mud gave way. Branches loosened. The sun reached deeper. Some locals admitted that in the years before, when the river was lower than usual, they'd seen shadows, ambiguous shapes under the surface. "Just my imagination," they said. But now those shadows made sense. Investigators noted something strange about the car's position. It wasn't aligned with the road's curve. Instead of following the trajectory, if someone lost control and veered off, the car seemed rotated. The driver's side faced upstream, angled oddly. That raised questions. Was it drifting after entering the water, or had someone manipulated it later? Another detail. The windshield had a round, clean hole like a bullet hole. No cracks radiated, no spidering glass shards, just a circular puncture. That detail, remembered from declassified deposition notes taken decades ago, took on new gravity. When Leland opened the trunk, he found something else, a long, rusty metal case. Inside, old car parts, tools, bolts, the garbled remnants of what might have been road repairs or modifications. Among them, a small pouch. Inside the pouch, a faded photograph, torn at the edges, showing two young people standing by a river bend, faces too blurry to confirm, but unmistakably from the era. A neighbor, Marvin's daughter Lydia, came forward with a memory. As a child, she'd sometimes fished near that bend at twilight. She remembered seeing a car halfway submerged in water, just the top of it, and telling her dad he'd told her not to speak of it. She never understood why, until now. Now she saw the car resurfaced in her mind. They cordoned off the site, brought in sonar mapping, sediment testing, core samples. They measured how much silt had built up. They charted the river's shifts, how floods and droughts had reshaped banks. One hydrologist told Leland, "What you see now is not how it was. That bend used to be deeper. The river used to flow faster there. Over time, silt and debris accumulated, burying the car. Only when the current weakened, when the drought starved the channel, did those covering layers recede." In other words, the car had been swallowed slowly, silently, by time. Henderson awakens. News spread like wildfire. By dusk, every TV, radio, and smartphone in Henderson had the headline, "Missing since 1968. Couple found in submerged car after 56 years." Neighbors came to the discovery site, drawn by curiosity and grief. Some brought bouquets, wildflowers, daisies, placing them near the tow winches, the tape, the muddy bank. Others stood back, silent, staring at the car as if it might speak to them. Martha Green, Karen's longest friend, walked slowly through the crowd. She wore a faded blue blouse, the same color as Karen's dress, she said later. She dropped to her knees at the car, touching the driver's door, tears in her eyes. The authorities allowed it. For a moment, the river's secret was in her hands. At dusk, the sheriff quietly went to the nearby church. He lit a candle and prayed that the new evidence would bring justice, not just closure. That night, the town held vigil. In the square, someone set up a table with Karen's photo. People came and lit candles. Some said prayers, others just cried. The forked Deer River, usually silent in darkness, seemed to shimmer faintly under moonlight as though it was listening. For Henderson, the mistake of forgetting was shameful. Now the river was forcing them to remember. A turn in the investigation. Within 24 hours of recovery, the coroner's office confirmed the remains were indeed those of Thomas Whitmore and Karen Whitmore. DNA matched the descendants. The bones, decades underwater, still bore telltale signs: small fragments of clothing, rust-stained metal, residue of soil between the ribs. That confirmation sent ripples. The case was no longer theoretical, it was fact. The next day, Leland announced that the Whitmore disappearance would be reopened as a homicide investigation. New forensic teams arrived. They mapped the car's interior, looking for traces of gunpowder, bullet fragments, or bone shards, inconsistent with drowning. They scrutinized the hole in the windshield. They analyzed the shape of the puncture. Was it 22? 38? Something more exotic? Was it entry or exit? They cataloged the mysterious pouch from the trunk. Photographers began enhancing the old photograph. They searched records for any mention of a third party, someone who might have driven them, someone named Doyle, the mysterious name in Cobb's old notes, anyone with motive from the era. Leland leaned into history. He compassed maps from the 60s, overlaying them onto current geospatial data. He compared witness statements from decades ago, dusted off old interviews, re-interviewed old residents who had moved away. He also reached out to state cold case divisions, forensic pathologists, and crime labs, bringing modern tools to a 60-year-old puzzle. Already, faint connections began to emerge. A repair invoice in Jackson from 1967 with the name Doyle on it. A scrap of blue fabric found near an abandoned barn matching the seat upholstery. A ledger entry in a local junkyard that listed a 1957 Bel Air body as acquired in late 1968, but never broken down. The community watched. The media descended. What had long been a ghost story was now a real crime scene. The river's reckoning. That night, the riverbeds shifted under the moon. Crickets thrummed. Frogs croaked. The water pool near the car rippled faintly. The little eddies seemed to circle it, like they were paying homage. As the crowd dispersed, a thought took root in many minds. The river had waited 56 years, patient, silent, unmoving, and when it finally spoke, it did so in metal and bone and dust. Henderson would never be the same. The river's reclamation of that car was more than a discovery. It was a reckoning. And the truth, long buried, was trailing toward the surface slowly, inevitably, carrying with it questions no one yet knew how to answer. For weeks after the discovery, Henderson pulsed with tension, half relief, half dread. The Whitmores had finally come home, but their return only deepened the question that haunted the town for more than half a century. What really happened that night? Sheriff Mark Leland watched the forensics team dismantle the Bel Air piece by piece. Every screw, every hinge, every patch of rust told a story. The mud inside the cabin had preserved more than anyone expected. Beneath the layer of silt, investigators found traces of glass from the inside of the windshield, meaning the hole wasn't caused by something flying out. It came from outside in. The neat, circular puncture, the lack of fractures, and the small diameter suggested a low-caliber weapon fired at close range. Someone had shot into the car. Inside the driver's seat, near the base of the skull, they found a tiny fragment of lead lodged in what remained of bone. It was a match. Tommy had been shot once, instantly incapacitated. The car had rolled forward, unmanned, straight into the river. Karen's seatbelt was still fastened. Her bones bore no impact fractures, no defensive wounds. Forensic reconstruction showed she had likely drowned, trapped in the sinking car beside the man she loved. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Leland dug into the old files. The name Doyle resurfaced again, scribbled in the margin of Sheriff Cobb's 1,968 notes. He traced it to a man named Franklin Doyle, a used parts dealer from Jackson with a history of extortion and car theft. Records showed he'd been investigated in 1972 for running a black market parts ring, and that one of his associates had once done business with Tommy's garage. Tommy had owed Doyle money for car parts he'd bought on credit, trying to expand the shop. When Doyle threatened to repossess his equipment, Tommy refused to pay, saying he'd been overcharged. The last phone call from the garage before the disappearance was traced to Doyle's office. Franklin Doyle was questioned back then, briefly, but he'd left town the same week the Whitmores vanished. He died in 1984, never charged. When Leland found Doyle's old case file, he noticed something chilling. A faded photograph attached to the file, Doyle leaning against a brown truck, wearing a leather jacket. The same man witnesses saw at the lake that night. Everything fit. Doyle must have followed them from the dance. The argument turned violent. One shot through the windshield. The car rolled down the embankment and into the forked Deer River. The current and the darkness swallowed the evidence. No one saw, no one heard, and the river kept the secret for 56 years. The case was closed quietly, but not with fanfare. There was no trial, no arrest to make. The man responsible had been buried for 40 years. Still, for the families that remained, the truth mattered. Martha Green, gray-haired now, spoke at the memorial. Tommy and Karen didn't run away, she said softly, voice cracking. They didn't leave us. They were taken, and the river, it kept them safe until we were ready to find them. That night, townsfolk gathered by the bend. The sheriff set a wreath in the water where the river ran deepest. The current caught it and carried it downstream. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the sound of water moving slow, steady, endless. As people turned to leave, Martha lingered. She swore she heard something faint, a woman's laughter, distant, soft, familiar, floating over the water, fading as it went. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe the river, having finally spoken its truth, was saying goodbye. The current glimmered once, then stilled. And Henderson, after 56 long years, finally exhaled.